It's now a very personal privilege to invite somebody who has been a champion of so many of the issues and concerns shared by people in this room. Professor the Hon Gareth Evans has been Chancellor of the Australian National University since January 2010. He's previously spent 21 years in Australian politics, 13 of them as a Cabinet Minister. As Foreign Minister, he was best known internationally for his roles in developing the UN Peace Plan for Cambodia and concluding the Chemical Weapons Convention. He has written several books, has published over 100 journal articles. In 2010, he was awarded the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Four Freedoms Award for freedom from fear for his pioneering work on the responsibility to protect that concept and his contribution to conflict prevention and resolution. He's really an Australian treasure and somebody who has really pioneered and advocated, as I said, for issues that concern all of us and has worked tirelessly for a safer, freer world. Please welcome the Honourable Gareth Evans.
Well, thanks very much, Adam. That introduction was a little bit over the top, but these days I feel I need all the introduction I can get, so thank you for that. No organisation in the world embodies as many dreams, yet delivers as many frustrations as the United Nations. Nothing could be nobler or more moving than the Charter's stated goals, not only to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, but to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. But it's only really rather occasionally and erratically that the UN has been the central player in advancing and achieving these objectives. I think we do have to acknowledge that for most of its history, the Security Council has been the prisoner of great power manoeuvring, the General Assembly, a theatre for often empty rhetoric, the Economic and Social Council, a largely dysfunctional irrelevance, sorry about that to some of the staff that are here, and the Secretariat for all the dedication and brilliance which I can testify to of a host of individuals, often alarmingly inefficient. When I think back on my own experience with the UN as Foreign Minister and for another 10 years after that leading the International Crisis Group based in Brussels, I have to say it involved exactly this contradiction. In all my years of public life, there's been no single institution which I found more exhilarating at its best, yet more debilitatingly frustrating at its worst. My efforts in particular, I have to say, to advance the cause of UN reform were about as quixotic and as unproductive as anything I've ever tried to do. I'm talking about reform of secretariat structures to reduce duplication, waste and irrelevance, reform of personnel practices to ensure the best people are always in the right jobs, but above all to try to reform the structure of the pinnacle of the whole system, the Security Council, to ensure that it at least began to reflect the world of the 21st century and not that of the middle of the last. But I've had equally a number of exhilarating experiences at its best. Let me tell you about three of them, just very quickly. The first was the success of our peace plan for Cambodia in the early 90s, which Adam mentioned, which dragged Cambodia back from a hellish nearly 2 decades of horrifying genocide and then ugly and protracted civil war. Our plan was, in a nutshell, based on getting the UN to do something that it had never previously done of this kind, or at least on remotely this scale, namely to assume responsibility for a country's whole administration during its transition from war to peace. Our idea was that such a commitment by the United Nations would actually give China a face-saving reason for stepping back from its long-standing support for the genocidal Khmer Rouge, which was in turn the indispensable ingredient for that peace process coming together. And so it all worked out. And I've never been more moved by anything in my life Then the sight of those Cambodian men, women, children, lined up at the polling stations in their scores, their hundreds of thousands in May '93, knowing the risk of Khmer Rouge bomb attack, but thrilled at the prospect of peace at last and the chance to have some say at last in how they lived their lives. The second real sense of achievement was in successfully steering to conclusion a year earlier through the labyrinthine machinations of the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, the Chemical Weapons Convention, also mentioned by Adam in his introduction. Still the most robust arms control treaty related to weapons of mass destruction that's ever been negotiated. An achievement, I'm sad to say, that was rendered that much more piquant by knowing that the conference has not since negotiated anything successfully for the last 20 years, including its own work program. But there we are. The third time of exhilaration, and this really was an exhilarating time, was when the General Assembly, sitting at head of state and government level as the World Summit 2005 on the 60th anniversary of the UN, unanimously endorsed the concept of states' responsibility to protect their own people from genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, a concept which I'd been centrally involved in developing in the International Commission that I co-chaired a few years earlier and have been promoting ever since, in the hope that once and for all, as an international community, we can eradicate the shame of the Holocaust, of Rwanda, of Srebrenica, of Darfur. That exhilaration was reinforced when responsibility to protect was invoked as the rationale for the intervention in Libya in 2011, which unquestionably saved scores of thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost, as so many millions of other lives were lost from these sorts of catastrophes in the past. The trouble is that for every high in the UN, there usually seems to be an accompanying low, and that really happened with responsibility to protect, R2P, not long after the Libya decision, with the Security Council's total paralysis over, in many ways, the even worse atrocity crime situation that developed in Syria and which has continued to this day. I believe that there is actually a way of regenerating consensus among the major players in the Security Council as to the very limited circumstances in which it is right to militarily intervene in a sovereign country to protect its citizens. And that's a proposal based on something Brazil has put forward, which it calls responsibility while protecting. And I hope very much that during Australia's present two-year term on the Council, we can take ourselves some kind of serious initiative that will help build that consensus. There are a lot of good news stories that should be told about the UN at its best. I believe that there are few better people to tell them in communities around the world than you, the more than 2,000 brilliant, passionately committed young students who gathered here this week in Melbourne, this 22nd World Model UN Conference, the first to be held in Australia. One of the things that you can tell people, because most people haven't the faintest idea, is just how many different roles are played by the UN, by the multiple departments and programs and organs and agencies within the UN system across the whole spectrum of issues and areas, from peace and security between and within countries, to human rights and human security more generally, health, education, poverty alleviation, disaster relief, refugee protection, people and drug trafficking, heritage protection, climate, the environment, many others as well. Nor do most people begin to appreciate, and they really have to be told, just how many of these agencies have in fact performed outstandingly well for many decades, and really how very comparatively little it all costs. Let me just give you some specific figures which you can use to silence some of the doubters, some of the skeptics about the UN system. The core functions of the UN, leaving aside for a moment peacekeeping missions, but counting everything that goes on in the big headquarters in New York, the big UN offices in Geneva and Vienna and Nairobi, and the 5 regional commissions spread around the world, those core functions currently involve the employment of 44,000 people at a regular budget cost of around $2.5 billion a year. Well, that sounds a lot, but maybe not quite so much when you realise, to take examples from just 3 of the 193 member states, that the Tokyo Fire Department spends about the same amount each year. The Australian Department of Human Services, with rather less staff, spends $3 billion more than the whole core system of the UN. And New York City, I have to say, spends about $66 billion more than the core functions of the whole UN. If you then add to these UN core functions the related programs and organs like the UN Development Programme, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and if you add the peacekeeping activities, which now involve some 110,000 international military, police and civilian peacekeepers, the total UN system cost is still just around $30 billion a year, 30, which again sounds a big number, and it is. But maybe not so much when you realise that it's much less than 1/3 of what the US military has been spending each year on just one current conflict in Afghanistan. And even more so when you realise that it's less than the amount, $30 billion, it's less than the amount that was actually paid out in Wall Street bonuses in 2007, the year before the global financial and economic crash. The whole family of UN Secretariat and related entities, together with current peacekeepers, adds up to around 215,000 people worldwide. Not a small number, but maybe one finally that is put in better context when you know that it's less than 1/8 of the 1.8 million staff employed by McDonald's and their franchisees around the world. So the bottom line in all of this is that the UN is fabulous value. Better value than the bankers, better value than hamburgers, for what the world spends on it. And that if it ever ceased to exist, we'd have to reinvent it. Yes, there are a lot of frustrations. I've talked about them, I've experienced them. Yes, it could still do better in all sorts of ways, which I hope that the next generation of world leaders, your own, will make happen. But what we need to remember, above all, as probably the most famous and respected of all the Secretaries General, Dag Hammarskjöld, put it in these immortal words of his, the UN was created not to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell. So congratulations to everyone responsible for bringing this fantastic conference together. Thank you for inviting me to be your patron, to join you today, and every best wish for a week of tremendously productive conferencing. Thank you.